You know, usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute precision. It feels, I don't know, very much like engineering.
Right. It's very clinical.
Yeah. Like, let's say you fall off your bike and you break your arm. You go to the hospital, they put you in that freezing cold room, and the x-ray pops up on the screen.
Oh, yeah, and you see that jagged white line right across the bone.
Exactly. And the doctor just points a pen at the screen and says, well, there it is. There is the problem.
It's binary. It's broken or not broken.
Yeah.
Very clean and clear.
And we find a lot of comfort in that kind of clarity, you know.
Yeah.
Human beings, we just love for things to be visible and easily identifiable.
We want to know the exact parameters of the issue.
Right, so we can apply a precise solution.
Hmm.
But then you step into the world of daily Christian living, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely busted.
Oh, completely. The diagnostic landscape gets incredibly murky.
It really does. So welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am so glad you're joining us today. We are taking a deep dive into Romans chapter 6, specifically zeroing in on verses 12 and 13.
Yeah, we've got a couple of highly detailed theological commentaries on the table today to help us out.
And we are using them to examine a tension that I guarantee you find relatable. It's this massive cognitive dissonance.
It's a universal struggle, really.
Right? On one hand, you have this staggering legal reality, right? You were declared perfectly righteous by grace in the courtroom of God. But on the other hand, you wake up every single morning in a physical, mortal body that feels the heavy, unrelenting pull of sin.
Yeah, and that cognitive dissonance is the specific target of the two commentaries we're looking at today. Both authors analyze the text, and they arrive at the same vivid conclusion regarding this tension.
And it's a fascinating analogy they use.
It is. They say sin is a deposed dictator attempting a violent, desperate coup. Think of a monarch who has been legally stripped of his crown.
Just totally kicked off the throne.
Yeah. Right. Banished from the palace. He no longer has the constitutional right to rule the country.
Well, he's not gone, is he?
No, he's out in the countryside fighting this gritty guerrilla war,
Yeah.
trying desperately to maintain functional control over the citizens.
So the goal of our discussion today is to understand the actual mechanics of how to dethrone that tyrant in your daily life. We're talking about how to actively consecrate your physical body to God.
Yeah, looking at the transition from that legal declaration of justification we mentioned to the practical boots-on-the-ground reality of sanctification.
Let's really unpack this, because whether you're fighting a very stubborn habit that you just cannot seem to shake, or maybe you're just looking to understand biblical sanctification on a broader level, this discussion is going to give you a stark, military-grade strategy for your daily life.
We are definitely not talking about abstract, floating theological concepts today.
No, we are talking about what you do with your eyes when you look at a screen, what you do with your hands at work, how you spend your time on a random Tuesday afternoon.
It gets intensely practical.
But to get our bearings, we have to set the historical scene. The context provided by these sources is just, it's fascinating. The year is roughly AD 57.
And Paul is writing this letter from the city of Corinth.
Right, but he is addressing it to the believers living in the imperial capital of Rome.
And we really have to stop and visualize what Rome was at that specific moment in history. I mean, this was the absolute epicenter of the known world.
It's operating under the heavy shadow of Emperor Nero, no less.
Yeah, the city was just completely saturated in military might. You had the constant presence of the Roman legions returning from conquests, parading their spoils through the streets.
Just columns of soldiers everywhere, the sound of marching, the armor.
Exactly. But alongside that strict military discipline, there was this extreme hedonism.
Oh, totally.
The culture glorified sensual indulgence, grotesque pagan rituals in the temples, and the brutal institution of slavery.
It was an intense place to live. The Roman believers were waking up every day surrounded by a society that basically worshipped physical dominance and the satisfaction of every single bodily appetite.
The atmosphere was incredibly intimidating. And it was into this specific cultural cauldron that Paul sent this letter.
Right, he's writing to a tiny minority of believers who are just swimming in this ocean of pagan imperialism. But before we look at the specific instructions Paul gives them in chapter 6, we need to understand the literary progression of the letter itself.
Yes, both of our sources are adamant about this. You can't just parachute into Romans chapter 6 without understanding the massive theological argument Paul builds in chapters 1 through 5.
It's all connected. So how do the sources map out that overarching structure?
Well, chapters 1 through 5 establish the doctrine of justification by faith alone. Paul, methodically, almost like a prosecuting attorney, proves that all humanity, Jew and Gentile alike, is completely guilty before a holy God.
No exception.
None. And then he presents the solution. Perfect righteousness is imputed, or legally credited, to the believer solely through faith in Jesus Christ, entirely apart from human works.
It's this stunning declaration of free grace.
It really is. But the moment you declare that grace is free and that justification is a completed legal reality that you cannot earn, you invite a very specific historical objection.
Right, the antinomian charge.
Spot on. And for the listener, antinomian comes from two Greek words. Anti, meaning against, and nomos, meaning law.
So against the law.
Right. The theoretical opponent steps up and says, wait a minute, Paul. If grace is completely free, and if my sin only makes God's grace look bigger and more magnificent, then shouldn't I just keep sinning?
It sounds almost logical in a twisted way, like if my bad behavior highlights God's good grace, let sin more so grace can abound.
And chapter 6 pivots directly to answer that exact charge. Paul just recoils at the thought. The Greek phrase he uses is me genoito.
Which is pretty intense, right?
It is the absolute strongest negative in the Greek language. It translates to may it never be, or perish the thought.
Wow.
Yeah, he spends the first 11 verses of chapter 6 explaining that through a spiritual union with Christ, believers are definitively dead to sin and alive to God.
And then we hit verses 12 and 13, which is where we were camping out today. This is where he delivers the practical, physical application of that spiritual reality.
Yes.
Okay, looking at the language Paul uses here, I have to ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it accurate to say Paul is using the atmosphere of the city against itself?
What do you mean by that?
Well, it kind of feels like using Wall Street lingo to talk to a room full of New York bankers.
Yeah.
Or using agricultural terms to talk to farmers in Iowa.
Mm.
Is he weaponizing Roman culture against Rome?
That is a fantastic analogy. And yes, the sources confirm this dynamic thoroughly. Remember, the Roman Christians lived their daily lives looking at the elite Praetorian Guard.
Right, they heard the rhythmic marching of soldiers on the cobblestones every single day.
They understood warfare, rigid command structures, and unquestioning loyalty to an emperor. The text leverages this intense military atmosphere to make its point.
So Paul starts using terms relating to heavy weaponry and royal dominion.
Yes, yielding absolute obedience to a commanding officer. He is presenting a call to absolute spiritual treason against Roman culture, while simultaneously demanding total, uncompromising loyalty to a new king.
I love that, spiritual treason. He is essentially telling these believers to stop taking orders from the hedonistic culture around them and to mobilize their physical bodies for a completely different empire.
That's it precisely.
So to understand this new loyalty and how this military strategy actually works in practice, we first have to look at the enemy that is trying to maintain control.
The deposed tyrant.
Right. This brings us to the actual command in verse 12. Paul writes, "Let not sin therefore reign."
The sources spend a significant amount of time unpacking that specific phrase. The Greek word Paul uses for reign is basileut.
Okay, what's the nuance there?
Well, in the first century, this word meant to exercise kingly rule, to act as a monarch, or to wield absolute sovereign authority over a domain.
It's not just a casual suggestion.
Not at all. And the grammar Paul uses here is incredibly revealing. It's formulated as a command to stop an action that is already in progress.
Oh, interesting. So Paul is not warning them about a future possibility.
No, he is looking at their current lives and saying, stop allowing sin to continue its reign. Cease this activity immediately.
And look at how sin is described here. It's personified.
Yes, very clearly.
It is not depicted as this abstract concept or a floating mist of bad energy or just a minor character flaw. Sin is depicted as a tyrant, a would-be monarch attempting to issue decrees, collect taxes, and demand unquestioning obedience from its subjects.
And the text points out the specific battlefield where this deposed tyrant is trying to plant its flag.
The mortal body.
Yes. The Greek word is thanatos.
This is where that X-ray machine analogy comes back into play, right? We are not talking about a spiritual battle floating somewhere up in the clouds. We are talking about your actual physical frame.
Your nervous system.
Right, your digestive tract, your brain chemistry. The physical body is the literal theater of this war.
And the commentaries clarify a crucial point here, which we really need to highlight. The body itself is not inherently evil.
That's a vital distinction.
Very much so, because many ancient Greek philosophies, like Gnosticism, taught that the spirit is good and the physical body is dirty or wicked.
And Christianity rejects that completely.
Entirely. God created the physical body, and he called it good. The issue is not that the body is evil. The issue is that the body is thanatos. It is mortal.
Ah.
Because it is mortal, it is subject to weakness, fatigue, hunger, and physical appetites.
And those natural biological realities become the primary avenues through which this deposed tyrant seeks to regain control.
Exactly. Sin attempts to exploit our very natural bodily functions and twist them into avenues of rebellion.
Okay, hold on. I need to push back on this logically because this is where the cognitive dissonance we talked about hits the hardest.
Okay, lay it on me.
If the tyrant is legally deposed, if he has been kicked off the throne by the grace of God, why am I still taking his orders?
It's a great question.
Like, how does a dethroned king get anyone to listen to him? If a government is overthrown, its laws are null and void. So why does my body still respond to his voice?
That is the central question of the Christian experience, isn't it? Why is the struggle so real if the victory is already won?
Right. Why is it so hard?
Well, the theological synthesis from the sources addresses this by looking closely at our redemptive timeline. Now, the sources handle this slightly differently based on their broader theological frameworks.
Let's get into that.
One of the commentaries approaches this from a dispensational, premillennial view.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener who might not be familiar with those specific terms.
Certainly. In a classical dispensational framework, the current period of history, the church age, is viewed as a parenthetical period. In this view, God deals with Israel and the church in distinct ways.
Okay, so how does that affect the body?
Well, believers in the current age are completely justified in their spirits the moment they believe, but they are awaiting a future pre-tribulational rapture where they will be removed from the earth.
Right.
And at that point, they will experience the future glorification of their physical bodies. So the body remains subject to mortality and the curse of the fall during this present age.
So in that view, the body is essentially lagging behind the soul. The soul is redeemed and seated in heavenly places, but the body is stuck in the mud of the present evil age.
That is a very helpful way to picture it. Now, whether you hold to that specific dispensational timeline or a more traditional Reformed covenantal view, both sources agree entirely on the practical consequence of our current state.
Okay, what's the common ground?
The central point of agreement is this. Our ongoing mortality makes the body the primary beachhead for temptation.
Because our physical substance is not yet glorified.
Exactly. We have not yet received our resurrection bodies. So sin utilizes our physical appetites, our daily fatigue, our ingrained neurological habits, and our natural human fears as livers to force compliance.
It's using our own biology against us.
Yes. The tyrant lost the massive, sweeping war for your eternal soul, so he settles for launching a gritty, exhausting guerrilla insurgency in the mortal body.
Okay, so if the mortal body is the battlefield, we need to examine the actual weapons being used in this insurgency. And this is where the language of the text gets incredibly aggressive.
It really does.
We move into verse 13, where Paul issues a strict prohibition against yielding our members as instruments of unrighteousness.
And the original Greek word translated as instruments is hopla.
Hopla.
Yes. The source material digs deep into the historical and cultural usage of this term, and it changes the entire tone of the passage.
How so?
When you read classical Greek writers, like the philosopher Xenophon or the military historian Thucydides, they use the word hopla overwhelmingly to describe heavy military weapons or combat gear.
Oh, wow. These are not just tools.
No, they are talking about the shield, the spear, the sword. It is an explicitly martial term. It is not referring to ordinary household tools or farming equipment.
Right, so we need to completely adjust our mental picture. This is not a farmer holding a plow. This is a Roman soldier holding a gladius.
Yes.
So yielding your physical members to sin is the equivalent of handing your loaded rifle over to the enemy while you are still wearing your own army's uniform.
That is exactly it. It is a direct act of supplying the opposition with the very firepower they need to destroy you.
That captures the terrifying severity of the text. I mean, handing over your weapons.
And the sources pull very specific modern examples to make this concept concrete. Because, it is easy to read ancient military analogies and disconnect them from our Tuesday mornings.
Yeah, it's easy to keep it theoretical.
Right. But they point out grim statistics regarding how our faculties are surrendered right now today. For example, the text notes that the average American is tethered to a smartphone for over 4 hours a day.
4 hours.
Effectively enslaved to the algorithms of social media, scrolling mindlessly. And more alarmingly, the sources cite the pervasive nature of pornography, noting that over 50% of men view it regularly.
Wow.
The authors argue these are not just bad habits or personal flaws, they are tactical surrenders. You are handing your hopla, your weapons, to the deposed tyrant.
Let's break down the mechanics of this, because I really want to understand how specific body parts act as weapons.
Yeah.
The sources go into great detail here, breaking the body down into specific faculties.
Right, they really isolate the parts.
We are talking about eyes viewing impurity on those glowing screens. We are talking about ears willingly listening to gossip, slander, or godless philosophies. Yes, tongues speaking deceit, sowing discord among friends, or constantly complaining against God's providence. Hands engaged in petty theft, or even just laziness and apathy. Every single physical faculty has the potential to be weaponized.
What stands out here is the stark realization that neutrality does not exist in the Christian life.
Say more about that.
Your eyes, your tongue, your hands, they are never just resting in a demilitarized zone. They're either being deployed for unrighteousness or they are being deployed for righteousness.
There's no middle ground.
No. The tyrant of sin wants to conscript your physical members to execute tangible acts of rebellion against God's law. When you look at something impure, you aren't just making a mistake. You are actively pulling the trigger of a weapon for the enemy.
You're giving the insurgency a foothold in your neurology and your habits. That is a heavy reality.
It is.
But Christianity is not a religion of mere negation, right? We aren't just told what not to do. Emptying your hands of bad weapons is only the first half of the equation. We cannot just stand around on the battlefield with our hands in our pockets, trying really hard not to sin.
That would be disastrous. And this brings us to what the sources call the grammar of grace and the concept of definite surrender.
Okay, I love this part. Talk about the grammar.
The exegetical breakdown of verse 13 highlights a critical grammatical shift that completely changes how we view sanctification.
Okay.
Paul uses two different verb tenses that carry massive implications. The negative command, neither yield your members to sin, uses the Greek word peristinet.
Christianity.
Yes. This is a present active imperative. In Greek grammar, a present imperative in a negative command means to stop an action that is currently becoming a habit.
Okay.
It implies you are currently handing over your weapons and you need to cease that action immediately.
Like saying, stop hitting yourself. It is something you are doing right now, and you need to cut it out.
Right. But then Paul gives the positive command, but yield yourselves to God. Here, he uses a completely different verbal form.
What does he use?
He uses the word peristosate, which is an aorist active imperative.
What's the difference?
An aorist imperative indicates a definitive, decisive, once-and-for-all action. It is not about a gradual process. It is a radical, comprehensive presentation of the entire self to God.
So it's not a slow fade.
No. It is the difference between stopping a bad habit and walking into a recruitment office to sign a lifelong pledge of allegiance.
And the text grounds this decisive action in a very specific identity component. Paul tells them to yield to God as those alive from the dead.
Yes.
Here is where it gets highly practical for the listener. How does this specific phrase, alive from the dead, prevent this whole discussion from becoming a heavy burden?
Because it can sound heavy.
Yeah, honestly, hearing about handing over rifles, fighting insurgencies, and monitoring my screen time, it can sound exhausting. It sounds like white-knuckling my way to good behavior.
It absolutely sounds exhausting if you think you are fighting in order to earn your life. But the core theological weight of this entire passage rests on this principle. Life precedes obedience.
Life comes first.
Always. The sources vigorously reject any theology that gets this backward. For instance, they reject the concept of synergistic regeneration.
Which is what?
Synergism is the idea that we have to cooperate with God's grace, doing our part so God can do his part to save us.
Okay, so a team effort.
Right, which they completely reject. They also reject what is historically known as Keswick theology.
Okay, let's explain Keswick theology, because a lot of people might hold to it without knowing the name.
Keswick theology, often associated with the higher life movement of the 19th century, is frequently summarized by the popular phrase, let go and let God.
Oh yeah, you hear that all the time.
You do. It promotes a passive approach to holiness, suggesting that any human striving is fleshly, and true victory only comes when you completely surrender your will and let the Holy Spirit do all the fighting for you.
And what do our commentaries say about that?
The authors of our sources argue that Romans 6 utterly dismantles that idea. The text insists on aggressive, strenuous, action-yielding weapons, fighting tyrants, but it is action rooted entirely in a completed, past-tense reality.
So the action is required, but the motive is different.
Exactly. You do not yield your body to gain life. You yield your body because you already possess life.
You fight from victory, not for victory.
That is the perfect summary. The logic of the passage is not present yourselves so that God might look at your effort and make you alive from the dead.
Right.
The logic is present yourselves as those who are already permanently alive from the dead. You are a resurrection person.
Think about the legal status of a corpse, right?
Hmm.
The tyrant has no legal claim over a dead man.
None at all.
And if that dead man is brought back to life by a new king, the old tyrant's warrants are completely useless.
They're shredded. This theology destroys both legalism, which says your obedience earns God's favor, and antinomianism, which says your obedience doesn't matter since grace covers it all.
Your obedience matters tremendously, but it is the fruit of your regeneration, not the root of your justification.
Yes.
All of this talk about victory in life requires looking at the actual source of that life. We cannot discuss being alive from the dead without discussing the one who historically conquered death.
Absolutely.
This leads us into the Christological reality of the text and the doctrine of federal headship.
If we zoom out and connect this specific passage to the bigger picture of redemptive history, the sources explain that by nature, every single human being is born under the headship of Adam.
Okay, federal headship. Think of federal headship like a president declaring war on behalf of a nation.
Right. The citizens don't vote on it. The federal head acts as their representative, and the whole country enters the war.
In the Garden of Eden, Adam was our federal head. He was our representative.
And when he rebelled, his failure plunged the entire human race into ruin. In Adam, we are born spiritually dead, entirely enslaved to the tyrant of sin.
But the staggering claim of the gospel is that believers have been legally and spiritually removed from the headship of Adam and united to the last Adam, Jesus Christ.
And the texts are very specific about the physical obedience of Christ during his earthly ministry.
This is so good. We talked earlier about our own bodies being weapons, our eyes, our hands, our tongues. The sources point out that Christ yielded his physical members perfectly during his incarnation.
Theologians call this his active obedience.
Right. The distinction between the active and passive obedience of Christ is central to understanding our own bodily consecration.
Christ didn't just come to earth on Good Friday to die. He lived 33 years in a mortal body.
Yes. And he yielded his eyes to look with intense compassion on the multitudes, never with lust or greed.
He yielded his tongue to speak only the unvarnished truth of the Father, never uttering a word of deceit, flattery, or manipulation.
He yielded his hands to heal the sick, touch the lepers, and bless the marginalized. He amassed a perfect record of righteousness in a physical body.
And ultimately, in his passive obedience, he yielded that same body to suffer the penalty of the law.
He yielded his physical back to the whips of the smiters, and his physical hands to the Roman nails. He yielded his mortal body to the cross as the ultimate instrument of righteousness to pay the massive debt we owed.
He accomplished in his physical body what we could never accomplish in our own strength.
And the sources detail how this text reveals Christ functioning perfectly in three distinct historical offices: prophet, priest, and king.
These three offices give us a comprehensive view of how Christ rescues us.
Break those down for us.
Sure. As prophet, Christ declares the absolute truth about freedom versus bondage. The surrounding culture claims that true freedom is the ability to do whatever your physical appetites desire.
Which we see everywhere today.
Right. But Christ the prophet speaks the truth that giving in to those unregulated desires is actually the deepest form of slavery.
Okay, and as priest.
As priest, he doesn't just teach us, he acts on our behalf. He purchases our freedom with his own blood, offering himself as the flawless, perfect sacrifice to completely satisfy divine justice.
And finally, as king.
As king, he enforces that freedom. He demands total allegiance, commanding us to take our physical weapons, our hopla, out of the hands of the tyrant and yield them to his sovereign, loving rule.
With Christ established as the rightful king who conquered the deposed tyrant, we have to look at how this theology hits the pavement in the 21st century.
Oh, it definitely hits the pavement.
How does this change your daily conduct and your interaction with modern culture? The sources pull absolutely no punches when it comes to the cultural pushback.
They lean heavily into what theologians call the third use of the law.
which is the moral law acting as a guide for the believer in grateful obedience.
Yes, and the specific applications demanded by the source material are incredibly direct. They challenge the current cultural zeitgeist head-on.
I noticed that. The authors get very specific.
They do. The texts urge the reader to vigorously reject certain modern evangelical trends that tend to coddle sin under the guise of therapeutic language, like using terms like brokenness or authenticity.
Right. The authors argue that labeling habitual sinful choices merely as brokenness is a subtle way to remove the call for repentance.
Exactly. It treats sin as a tragic disease that happened to you, rather than an act of rebellion that requires a military response.
I think it is fascinating how far the authors take this theology. They don't just keep it locked in the first century, they apply it directly to modern flashpoints.
Yeah, the second source explicitly applies this doctrine of bodily consecration to several contemporary societal issues. It argues that certain ideologies conflict directly with this text.
We should walk through those just to show how the author applies the text.
Mhm.
For instance, the commentary calls for the total rejection of the prosperity gospel.
Right. The argument there is that the prosperity gospel treats the physical body as an instrument solely designed for worldly wealth and temporal comfort.
Rather than a weapon meant for spiritual warfare.
Right, which completely contradicts the idea of yielding your members as hopeless.
And then it also calls for the rejection of evolutionary theory.
Yes, the source argues that if you view the human body as the product of blind, unguided material processes, you undermine the concept of the body as a purposeful, intelligent creation designed specifically for consecration to God.
Okay, and it goes even further into sociological issues.
It does. The author explicitly calls for the rejection of sociological frameworks like critical race theory and certain forms of egalitarianism.
Okay, what is the source's theological reasoning for making that connection?
Well, the source's argument against those specific movements is that they offer a false, works-based righteousness based on social grievances and historical power dynamics.
Okay.
The text argues that these ideologies substitute modern cultural categories of oppressor and oppressed for the biblical categories of sin, grace, and redemption in Christ.
So it's a substitution issue,
Oh.
according to the author.
Right. The author contends that adopting these frameworks distracts believers from the biblical mandate for personal holiness and the internal mortification of indwelling sin.
So we're conveying the author's precise stance here to show you how comprehensively they believe Romans 6 applies to modern cultural frameworks.
Yes, the demand from the text is for a complete, uncompromising rejection of any system, whether theological, biological, or sociological, that conflicts with presenting the body wholly to God.
So hearing all of this, what about the listener who feels completely overwhelmed?
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is. Someone who hears all this intense military language, who hears about rejecting massive cultural frameworks, about consecrating their eyes and their hands, and they look at their own life and see daily failures.
Because we all do.
We all have moments, maybe even today, where we realize we handed our rifle right back to the enemy. How does this text offer comfort to the exhausted soldier?
This is where the pastoral heart of the text truly shines through, and it is honestly the most beautiful part of the passage.
I agree.
The final application from the sources provides immense foundational comfort for the struggling believer. The comfort lies in recognizing the objective status of the enemy you are fighting.
You are fighting a deposed tyrant.
Yes. The very fact that you feel the conflict, the very fact that you are agonizing over your failures, mourning your sin, and desiring to obey God is undeniable empirical evidence of the new life within you.
Because dead men do not fight.
Exactly.
That is such a crucial point. A corpse does not struggle against gravity. If you throw a dead body in a river, it just floats downstream. It doesn't swim against the current.
Exactly right. The old master no longer owns you. You operate under a completely different domain now. You are under the domain of grace.
So the struggle is proof of life.
Yes, the conflict is incredibly hard. The guerrilla warfare in the mortal body is exhausting, and you will lose skirmishes. But the presence of the struggle itself proves you have been brought from death to life.
The tyrant is fighting you so fiercely, precisely because he no longer rules you.
Right. If you were still his willing subject, there would be no war.
That is an incredible paradigm shift. It takes the guilt and the exhaustion of the daily struggle and turns it into proof of life. It completely changes how you view your own frustration with sin.
It really does.
Okay, let's summarize the massive amount of ground we have covered today. The key takeaways from our deep dive into Romans 6 are clear.
Go for it.
Sin is a deposed dictator that has permanently lost its legal right to rule over you. Your physical, mortal body is the active battlefield where the remnants of this war are fought.
Yes, and the members of your body, your eyes, your ears, your hands, your thumbs on a screen, and your tongue are literal weapons that are never neutral.
And most importantly, your core identity is a resurrected soldier of the true king, fighting not to gain ground, but fighting from a place of completed victory.
The transition from the legal declaration of justification to the practical reality of sanctification requires us to recognize our true identity in Christ and mobilize our physical faculties accordingly.
You are alive from the dead. Therefore, yield your weapons to the one who gave you life.
Beautifully said.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to carry with you as you go about your week. I want you to think about this practically.
Take an honest inventory.
Right. If an outside observer were to analyze your daily physical habits, your screen time, the specific places your feet take you, the things your hands build or destroy, and the specific words you use in your conversations.
Everything.
And if they analyzed all of that data as if it were a visible military strategy, which king would they conclude you are taking orders from today?
That is the crucial diagnostic question for every believer.
It brings us right back to that broken X-ray machine we started with. The daily struggle against sin is murky, it is messy, and it happens down in the literal trenches of our physical bodies.
But the gospel gives us a perfectly clear, high-definition image of our legal standing.
You are alive from the dead, so pick up your weapon, stand your ground, and stop taking orders from a deposed tyrant. Until next time, keep thinking critically.